up, guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, thank you so much for clicking on this video. I hope you decide to stick around and like and subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell so that you know when I post new videos. I put out new content every Wednesday, and if you don't ring the bell, you won't know that it's there. If you are returning, thank you for clicking on another video of mine. I'm so happy that you're back. You are so special to me, and I love you most of all. Well, it's been a rough week, guys. I'm not gonna lie. If you follow me on TikTok or you know me personally and you know anything about my personal life lately, I've been going through some health things. Nothing huge, I hope. But it affects my hormones a lot. It affects my mental health a lot. So I've been working with doctors about getting my hormone levels balanced and hopefully figuring out a treatment that works. But I'm not going to get into that today because, but if you're wondering, that's why I look different than I normally do. I haven't had the energy to put in the effort to like do all my makeup like I usually do. So hopefully after this week, my hormone levels will go back to normal and everything will be as it should, but we'll see. Also, I promised last week that I would order the adapter I needed to get my microphone to work, and I did, and it still doesn't work. So I think it might be a problem with my phone. We're gonna try it this way and see how that works. And anyway, getting into this week's topic, I wanted to talk about a little theory that I've been floating around in my head about discerning information on the internet and why certain groups might be more susceptible to false information than others. This is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot because it's affecting my family on a very real level. My mom and my two aunts have been pulled into the QAnon thing. Yeah, I remember talking with my mom when she started getting into it back in like 2019, I think, about how, like, why do you trust these people on the internet that you follow? Like, anybody can put any information on the internet. Just because they say they're credible doesn't mean that they are. Like these doctors that she follows that talk about the dangers of modern medicine and why you shouldn't trust any doctors. And while I do think that there is a case to be made to think critically about the way that we conduct medicine in the United States, because sadly it's been a for-profit program for a long time and there's a lot more money to be made. It is true. And this is where I think people get sucked down into that rabbit hole, is because it is true that there is a lot more profit to be made off of selling treatments to sick people than to actually making people well. So that is a problem that I think deprivatizing the healthcare industry could solve a lot of. But I've looked into a lot of these doctors, and they're just selling snake oil. And I don't understand how people can look at that and say, yeah, that's the person that I want to follow. I should trust their advice. Like, these people have been decommissioned, have been thrown off of medical boards, have lost their licenses, like, for utter quackery. And while I do think that, like in any institution, sometimes you have outliers who try to speak up against actual injustice that's happening and are delegitimized by the industry at large because it threatens the industry's hegemonic control over that industry, right? And we see that a lot in medicine because it's such a huge industry in the United States. And a lot of people stand to lose a lot of money for actually treating people in a way that would be more humane than what they currently do. And like thinking about the ways in which Dr. Farid Fatah, for example, exploited his patients and gave them medicines that they didn't need and put them on chemo that they didn't need, that poisoned and in some cases killed them. Like, yeah, there's a problem there. And all to get rich. All to make money off of their pain and suffering. That's disgusting and it shouldn't be allowed. And that's why I want to deprivatize healthcare, because when getting rich is not the incentive, then that kind of problem doesn't exist so much. So there are a lot of things that we need to change about our healthcare industry, but following these kinds of doctors, I hesitate to even call them doctors, like to come out and say crazy outlandish things about life-saving medications. People like Andrew Wakefield, Dr. Jane Orient, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, people like this who peddle misinformation and take advantage of people's fears and gullibilities, all for a grift. These people have been decried and discredited within the medical community and the scientific community at large because they cherry pick their findings, right? They don't conduct the studies on an objective level. They look for a result that they want, and then they find it by cherry picking their results and then publishing nonsense. And these people get picked up by major publications and people believe it. People like my mom. Because there are no consequences. You can say anything you want on the internet, and under very, very few circumstances does anybody actually face any consequences for actually lying. I've talked on this channel before about how the left attacks itself when it comes to like tone policing and term policing within the community. Like we cancel people for having said one thing that they apologized for years and years and years ago. But when it comes to this type of qualitative misinformation that has an agenda that is backed by like shadow organizations with actual funding and resources, you can say anything you want to, and there are no consequences, and there is no transparency as far as whether or not it's true, and you're just allowed to blatantly lie and get away with it. Like, Andrew Wakefield came out after his study was debunked about how, and if you don't know who Andrew Wakefield is, he's a former doctor. He ran a study back in 1998 that connected the MMR vaccine to the development of autism in children. The link was tenuous at best, but he cherry-picked his information as fact. He later came out and said that he fudged the numbers and pretty much made everything up, but has since walked that back again and is back on this vaccines cause autism train. And unfortunately, he's been able to sell that. And we see anti-vax movements popping up all over the place, but a lot in the US, unfortunately. And as a result, we're seeing the resurgence of dead diseases that we thought we had mostly eradicated, like mumps and measles and polio. And what's scary about that is people who have jumped on this anti-vax train were not around when those things were prevalent, right? They weren't around when kids were stuck in iron lungs and lived short, painful lives. They didn't have to see that firsthand. So they don't remember how terrible it was before we vaccinated for things like that. And that's the privilege of living in a post-vaccine world, I guess, is that you don't have to see that. But as a result, we have people coming out with this misinformation that completely defeats the purpose. And then we have these things coming back. But anyway, so all this to say that misinformation, when peddled as scientific fact, is extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, I think the older generation is way more susceptible to being taken in by this kind of stuff. Not to say that young people don't get taken in, obviously they do, but I have a theory as to why a lot of boomers are on this train. So we're noticing a trend lately in the last, I want to say like 10 years or so, of young people not ascribing to religiosity as fiercely as their parents' generation did. So we have that as one factor, and I'll elaborate in a second. And then the other factor is the onset of the internet and the different way in which we absorb information today. So let's first talk about the religion aspect. So back when the boomers were children, religious belief was just way more widespread. You didn't have this whole movement of millennials and younger turning away from religion like you see now. Everybody was religious. And the predominant idea back then was that if you weren't religious, you were amoral and something was wrong with you. So everybody kind of ascribed to a religion. And mostly, if we're talking about the US, Christianity. I mean, let's be real. So back in like the late 1940s and throughout the 50s, the percentage of the Christian population was really high. It was about 80% in the United States, at least of those surveyed that identified as some type of Christian. And that stayed pretty consistent through the 1960s until the late 60s when we see a sharp drop. But the drop that we've seen in religiosity within the last 15 years is nothing like we've seen in America in the past. So it's about twice as much of a drop in religiosity than we saw in any of those trends between the late 1960s and the 1990s. Nowadays, we see the amount of people who identify as some kind of Christian dropping to below 40% for the first time ever. So why this is significant when it comes to absorbing information is because when you're raised within a religious organization, you're taught not to question information. And I know this from experience. I was raised Christian. Basically, the attitude is God's word is the law. You don't question God. You don't question the people who teach God's word. It is the way things are. And if you go against that in any way, you're a terrible, immoral person. And then you get, outsized from the community and all that stuff. So you don't question. They are taught not to question anything when it comes from trusted sources, what a trusted source is within the community changes with, it seems like it changes with the hour, but it changes quite frequently. But generally speaking, trust the Bible. Trust people who are teaching the Bible. And it used to be trust the government, but not quite so much anymore. Definitely don't trust science. That has always been a Christian thing. Every time there's a new scientific advancement, it is completely shunned by the Christian community. So, discovering that the earth was round, that the earth is not the center of the universe. Look what happened to Galileo. The Big Bang Theory, the theory of evolution, all these things immediately rejected by Christians because it doesn't fall in line with their doctrine. And you don't question the doctrine. And so if science says something that is contrary to the doctrine, science must be wrong. So this is where we get this whole rejection of science, rejection of the experts, people who really know what they're talking about, rejection of intellectualism on the whole. So that's part of the problem. And then the other part of the problem that I mentioned was this new age of information that we find ourselves in and how we consume information and where it comes from. Here's what I think is one of the core reasons why boomers are more susceptible to misinformation is because in the day that they were raised, there was only one source of information. Maybe there were two. Like you would watch the news either on TV or you would read newspapers. And that's how you got your news. That's how you got information. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have the internet, obviously. So if you wanted to study deeper into a subject, you had to go to the library. You had to read an encyclopedia. You had to know what you were looking for. You couldn't just soak up information. So you had to trust the sources where your information was coming from, like the news channels and the newspapers, right? And as such, there was this thing called journalistic integrity, where there were rules and regulations about presenting information in a way that wasn't dishonest. And if a news reporter made a mistake, they would have to come back and correct it because you're not allowed to lie. There used to be rules about this. One of them was called the Fairness Doctrine. I don't think the Fairness Doctrine went far enough because it tried to make the playing field level, and it actually had an adverse effect which allowed for the rise of Fox News. They don't give news, right? Ugh. Whenever Fox News is taken to court on the merits of their information, they always argue that it's just meant for entertainment. Nobody's actually supposed to take it seriously. And yet millions of people do, as we know, because they call themselves news. Anyway, so that's part of the issue, is that news organizations used to be held to account with the quality of the information that they were putting out. And unfortunately, through lax regulations, and then people like, I don't even like to say that, him being allowed to lie every other word and get away with it, and nobody ever fact-checked him, nobody ever, and even if people did fact-check him, they would be discredited and just called fake news. So the lack of journalistic integrity that we've been experiencing over the last 20, 30 years, since I'd like to say since Reagan was in office, I think that's when the Fairness Doctrine went out. Yeah, it was revoked in 1985. Gee, I wonder why. Republicans are allergic to facts. Excuse me. Ever since that happened, and we've seen this gradual decline of journalistic integrity within the last 30 years, it's allowed for the rise of any information from anywhere can be deemed as credible. And we see what would have been considered back in the day tabloid publications like Breitbart getting cited as as an actual news outlet. And they never have to publish retractions. They never have to publish corrections. They're allowed to just say whatever they want and call it news. Ugh. And then we see the rise of organizations that are even further to the right than that, like Newsmax and OANN. And people take it as actual fact because that's how they were trained. Because remember, when they were growing up, you had to trust the media. You had no other source of information. So now that there are all of this just myriad of choices, they pick the one that sounds best to them, that they like to hear from. So they're watching Fox News, they're watching OANN, they're watching Newsmax, they're listening to Bill O'Reilly and Tucker Carlson and all those kinds of grifters who have a straight up agenda that they're trying to promote. It's all propaganda. All that they do is propaganda, either for a right-wing agenda or against a marginalized group. All of it. That's all it is. Every single little thing that comes out of their mouth is propaganda. And the reason why boomers tend to trust that stuff more than the younger generations is because that's how they were raised. You trust your news outlet, you trust your media organization, and therefore, since they're saying the thing that you like, they must be telling the truth because you trust that organization, right? It's where information comes from. And I lied, actually. There is a third factor. The way that the schooling was set up back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and until very recently, actually, my generation was among the first to actually be taught critical thinking, but they weren't taught that at all. Schooling was about memorizing what was on the paper and then applying that to the answers on the test. So they were never taught how to think critically about this stuff and how to research it in a way that yields true information. So we've got religious indoctrination. Don't question anything, right? We've got one source of information, so you have to trust what they're saying. And then we've got schooling teaching you that this is the way it's done, and that's just it. So those three things together make for a dangerous... My upstairs neighbor's floorboards are so creaky. It actually keeps me up at night sometimes because she doesn't sleep. Anyway, so you put all those three things together and you get a very dangerous combination of trusting the wrong information. Very consistently, my mom will bring me information that she's claimed she's researched, but her research only includes sources that confirm what she already thinks, right? So she'll bring me this information and and it's easily refuted, right? It's easily debunked. It only takes a quick Google search, but because she filters her results based on what she already thinks, and she was never taught how to think critically about that stuff. And I don't know how to get her out of that because I've tried. I'll send her counter information and she just calls it fake news and shrugs it off.
Oh, that source is bought off.
Oh, really? You think the AP is less biased than your source? Than, like, Breitbart or something? Wow. Like, actual news sources have to adhere to a certain guideline of integrity. That's kind of how you tell the difference, right? If a news organization is willing to police itself, as it were, and maintain a certain level of integrity, then they're automatically going to be more viable than a news organization that has none of that, doesn't care about that, doesn't care about what the facts are. It just publishes headlines that get clicks. So yeah, I don't know what to do about it, but that's my theory about why boomers are more susceptible to misinformation than the rest of us. Religious indoctrination, lack of critical thinking skills, and trusting information that repeats what you want to hear. Because somebody's saying it on the internet, so it must be true. Somebody's claiming that they're credible and that they're a doctor and that they don't trust vaccines because of that, so it must be true. And yet we see them rejecting facts, science, and expertise on a constant basis. So that was depressing. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do about it. I am struggling with my mom right now. It's been like this for a while, but she's isolated right now. She lives alone and she has very little contact with people at the moment, not just because of COVID, but because of where she lives. And as a result, she just gets sucked deeper and deeper into her little bubble, into her little nothing is real and all conspiracies are true bubble. So if anybody has any advice or you know of any channels on here that I should follow, you know, about de-radicalization and deprogramming, that would be wonderful. Please send them my way. I want to see it. All right, guys. Well, I'm sorry for the depressing topic today, but I felt like it was important to share, in case you were wondering why certain age groups are more susceptible to being misled down this like Q path than the rest of us. I think that's why. If I find any resources between now and when I post this, I will add them to the description for you guys to take a look at as far as this conundrum of pulling relatives out of the conspiracy hole. Because I think we're going to have a lot. We're going to have to do that a lot in the next several years with our parents. So, fun. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me. And if you guys have anything to add to the conversation, or if you have links to any resources that you want to recommend, please drop them in the comments. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this video, and ring the bell if you want to be notified when I post new videos so that you get them when they go up. Also, I've got new merch in my shop. It's all Pride themed, so get your Pride gear in order for Pride next month. That is also in the description. All right, guys. Well, that's it from me for this week, and I will see you next Wednesday. Have a lovely weekend.